I hope you're doing well. This is a summary of 2 Samuel chapter 23. The purpose of this is just to give you an overview. What we'd encourage you to do is get on the website, check out the commentary. There's a lot more information there, and then definitely go to care group. Make sure you get those times together in teaching with your care group leader. However, just to give you a summary of this, we're going to talk through the two parts of 2 Samuel 23. The first part is David's last song. The author calls it his last words, and then we're going to talk about the mighty men. And so there's just two sections here. So the first part is this part that's David's last song or his last words, and obviously these aren't his very last words. It's just his last commentary or his last psalm that he writes, and so that's why it's called this. And what it says in verse 1 is there's four statements that seem to be describing him. The first one is David, the son of Jesse, and which we would expect is him, the man who was raised on high. And so those two things in the first two lines there, one describes his earthly birth, and then the other describes how God has lifted him up. So he was the last son of a relatively obscure man in Bethlehem, and now he's been lifted up in order to be the king of Israel. And so that's from his birth, which was very low, to his elevation is very high. And what he's saying is this is God who has lifted him up, the one who was raised on high by God there. And then the word declares is there twice, and that's the word in Hebrew for oracle. And so this is really an oracle. It's a prophecy. And this becomes very important, you'll see when we get into this, because it's really a prophecy about the Messiah. And so then it says, the anointed of the God of Jacob and the sweet psalmist of Israel. Now there's some debate here. Some people say this is concerning the anointed of the God of Jacob and the sweet psalmist of Israel. So that, and the protector of Israel, or the one that Israel sings about. You know, there's a lot of confusion about the Hebrew. It's not super clear. That would mean that David is talking about the Messiah. The way that it's translated in the New American Standard, the anointed of the God of Israel, that would be David himself. He's been anointed by God. And then it says the sweet psalmist of Israel. That would mean that he's the one who writes the Psalms, and he's talking about himself. Well, either way we take this, it's not a huge deal, because either way we take this, we're going to finally conclude that the psalm is about the Messiah, but from other parts of the psalm. And so whether David's talking about himself or the Messiah isn't a make or break deal. My opinion is that he's talking about himself here in these two lines, and he's just describing who he is. Part of the reason why I think that is because of what is said in verse 2. In verse 2, he switches to first person. So I think he's talking about himself in these four introductory statements. And then in verse 2, he talks about himself again, but he talks about himself now in the first person. So third person to first person, he's saying, I'm the one who's writing this, and God has now spoken through me. And you see this in verse 2. It says, the Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke to me. So we have him self-aware enough to know that he's speaking for God. He's speaking for the God of Israel, which is great. It's good for us to know that even as the biblical author is writing Spirit-inspired text, he's doing it with the knowledge that he is speaking for God. He's aware that the Spirit of God is speaking through him. And so we see this in the New Testament as well. Paul says, this is the word of the Lord. He gives a statement. He says, this is the word of the Lord, and anyone who doesn't listen to it is not spiritual. So the same idea is here. David is saying the Spirit of God is speaking through me, and the rock of Israel has spoken through me. So that's what he's communicating. God is communicating through David. Important, David's got a ton of other psalms where he prophesies, and we know that. They're always messianic prophecies. Now, what's happening here in this prophecy? What he says in verse 3, halfway through, verse 3b, it says, he who rules over men righteously, who rules in the fear of God. Okay, so who is that? Well, it's not David. We've already seen his life was full of failure all the way through all of the chapters, all the way up until chapter 20. He's just struggled. Starting in chapter 11, all the way through chapter 20, he's just struggled. And all of that is the result of his sin, his flesh, because of his lust, his cravings after women, and all sorts of weaknesses in terms of his leadership that fell out from that. So when he says, he who rules over men righteously, who rules in the fear of God, he's not talking about himself. So there's a question, who's he talking about? Well, we'll find out in just a minute. But what we see in verse 4 is that this one who rules in righteousness and in reverence for God, he says, is as the light of the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, when the tender grass springs out of the earth through sunshine after rain. Well, what's all that description? Well, long story short, that's the description of light, right? Light that's shining and on fresh mown grass, on this fresh, beautiful scene after the rain. You can imagine the picture of it. The grass, freshly cut, is glistening, and the light is coming through on a cloudless morning. It's cool. It's a beautiful picture of freshness and cleanness and peace, and that's what's being communicated. So he says, this righteous ruler will bring all of these things: freshness, purity, cleanness, peace. Well, that's clearly talking about someone who is righteous. And we know actually from other texts, such as Psalm 72, which I'll let you look up on your own. In Psalm 72, this picture of the freshly mown grass and the rain that comes down upon it and the light that's connected there is all linked back again to the Messiah, to the righteous King who will rule forever. And so you have this picture of all of these things. Well, who is that? Well, clearly that's Jesus. That's the Messiah. You say, well, are we sure that that's the Messiah? Well, the answer is yes. Look at verse 5. He says, truly is not my house so with God. Now, there's some debate there. Some people say he's saying, my house isn't like that. But we would say he is saying, my house is like this, actually. That's his point. And it's not him, notice. He's not saying, my reign is righteous like this. He's saying, my house is like this. Why would he use the word house? It's important. 2 Samuel chapter 7, God says, I will make a house for you. And then David, after hearing that promise, turns to God, and in his thanksgiving, starting in verse 18 of 2 Samuel chapter 7, he says, what am I and what is my house that you would make this promise for me? So God is speaking clearly about the house of David, about the lineage of David, and what will come from the lineage of David is a house which will ultimately terminate in the Messiah, the one who will rule in this righteousness. And so guess what? The son of David will come, and that son of David is the righteous one who will ultimately fulfill this. He will bring about peace, freshness, purity, all those things that are promised through the light of his glory, which will ultimately cover the whole earth. This is a prophecy about the Messiah, and that's very clear. And so he says, truly is not my house so with God. Yes, it is. His house is so with God. Why? And the next line is very important. It says, for he has made an everlasting covenant with me. Now, this is important language, an everlasting covenant. The words in Hebrew are berit olam. It's very loaded language, a covenant which lasts forever, a covenant unto the ages. And the point here is that God has made a covenant with David that will not end until this righteous ruler comes. Well, the only other times that's never used, those words are never used in 2 Samuel 7, but they are used of the Noahic covenant and of the Abrahamic covenant. And now the Davidic covenant, David says, what God told me in 2 Samuel 7 is actually an eternal covenant that he has made with me and with my house. And so all of this is super important. What he's saying is God has made a covenant which will ultimately terminate in the Messiah, and I am prophesying of this coming one who will be the king. And what he says is that covenant is ordered in all things and secured. Well, why is that? Because God made it. It's a unilateral covenant from God to David. And he says, for all my salvation and all my desire, will he not indeed make it grow? Now, the word grow there is actually the word sprout. It's where we get the word branch. And you know this from other prophecies, such as Jeremiah chapter 27 and Zechariah, and even Christ himself at the end of the book of Revelation. He is the branch, the one who has branched out of David, the one who has sprung from the root of Jesse. Who is that? That's Jesus, right? And so that's the exact same language. He says, the one who is my desire and my salvation, he will sprout. God will indeed make it sprout. The Messiah will come from me is essentially what David is saying. Then he says, but the worthless, every one of them will be thrust away like thorns because they cannot be taken in hand. So the worthless are those who are prickly, they're thorns, they're actually good for nothing. They should be thrown away and burnt. And how do we know that? Well, that's the Messiah coming in condemnation and judgment. Verse 7, he says, but the man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they will be completely burned with fire in their place. That language of carrying an iron spear shaft is very important. That comes from Psalm chapter 2. And you remember, God says, I will install my king on my holy mountain in Zion, and he will rule with a rod of iron. He will crush those who rebel. Well, what is this? This is a picture of the judgment of the Messiah. And so even within Israel, there will be some who are spared and who are cared for and who receive this purity and freshness. And there will also be those who are worthless, who are Belial, the ones who are of Satan. They're useless, and Christ will crush them in judgment. So this is one massive prophecy about the Messiah that will come, and all of it links together into all sorts of different texts in Scripture, all of it pulled together into this one relatively simple prophecy. And that should be expected because this is coming out now of the chiasm. The center of the chiasm is verse 51 of chapter 22, that God is a tower of deliverance for his king, and he shows loving kindness. He shows covenant loyalty to his anointed, his Mashiach, to David and to his seed forever. And so the covenant loyalty to David and to his seed is now connected back to God, who is the loyal one. Why? Where do we see that loyalty? Well, we see it in the Berit Olam, the eternal covenant that God has made with David, which will ultimately terminate in the Messiah. And then we see that being carried out with David's mighty men, the heroes of battle. Starting in verse 8, we have this long list of heroes. Why include all these? Well, the point, and you're going to see this throughout this text, is that very clearly God is the one who is causing victories. He's bringing victories to pass. For example, the first guy on the list is this guy named Josheb Bashebeth. And what does he do? Well, it says he kills 800 people at one time. When did that happen? Well, it might not be just one day, one battle. It might have been one campaign where they're out fighting the Philistines over the course of time, maybe a few weeks, and he kills 800 people. Regardless, this is really a miraculous feat. What's the point? The point is that God is on his side. He kills people. He's number one on the list of the mightiest of men. If God's going to protect his king, he's going to have an army. And the first guy on that army is just like a Superman in terms of soldiers. And it's this guy named Josheb-Basshebeth. And so that's the point. God is protecting David through some incredibly powerful warriors. And we even have that stated for us explicitly starting in verses 9 and 10. We have Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the Ahohite. And it says that the Philistines had come. They were going to kill, and the people of Israel had run away from this battle. This guy, Eleazar, he stands up with David and he fights until his hand clings to his sword. And it says the Lord brought about a great victory that day. You have this guy who stands effectively single-handedly with David. Those two together stand single-handedly against the Philistines. And it says God brought about a great victory. Well, what's the point? It's not the mighty man. It's God who brought about the victory. And that exact same language is repeated with Shammah in verses 11 and 12. Shammah, the son of Agi, the Hararite. The Philistines were gathered there to steal some lentils, or to steal this plot of land that was filled with lentils. All the soldiers fled from the Philistines. But what does this guy do? He takes his stand in the middle of the field, and he defends it, and he strikes the Philistines. And again, the Lord brings about a great victory. So you have that God is caring for his people through these three really remarkable warriors. Okay. Then you have this story of David, and he's longing for a drink of water from the well of Bethlehem. It's really a beautiful picture of his hometown. He's homesick. He's up in the cave of Adullam. You got a lot of Philistines. It's probably early on in his reign because the Philistines have a garrison in Bethlehem, and he has already driven them out by the end of his reign. But effectively, David says, I wish I had a drink of water. And these guys, these three mighty men, go and get him a drink of water out of the well. It's amazing. They break through the line of the Philistines. Probably an incredibly valiant effort for them to do this. And what's the whole point? They're not even named. The mighty men aren't even named. What's the point? What God is saying is, I'm caring for David, even in the smallest of things. And David understands this because when they bring him back the water, he actually pours it out as an offering to the Lord. And he says, look, I can't drink this. This is your blood, effectively. Thank you so much for bringing it to me. I can't drink it. And he pours it out before the Lord. It's actually honoring the men who have done this thing for him. And then it's him saying, look, because you've done this thing for me, I am actually worshiping God because of it. Ultimately, it's God who's led you to this place. And so you have another picture of David seeing the kindness of God over him through these incredibly powerful warriors. Then you have a couple other people who don't attain to the first three, but who are in the next group. And this next group is called the 30, which is probably a technical term. There were 30 soldiers who sort of were the elite fighting force of Israel. And when one of them died, they would be replaced by somebody else. We see that because this list of 30 will actually contain 37. So the first one that we see is Abishai, the brother of Joab. Now we know Abishai, he's the son of Zeruiah. They're crazy. He's a killer. He's a killing machine. He wants to kill everyone. Well, yeah, that's true, but he's also a great warrior. And the point is he has the power to do that. It says, swung his spear against 300 and killed them. That's probably accurate. He probably killed 300 people. Now, again, whether that was during one battle or one campaign or over the course of a number of campaigns, we don't know. But we do know that clearly he's an impressive warrior. He's got 300 plus people that he's killed. And it says he's the most honored of the 30. So the first three are the best. And then there's this group of 30 that's underneath the three that are at the top. And the first one there is Abishai. He's the commander. So these are kind of his personal troops that he's gathered together. The second guy is Banaya, the son of Jehoiada. Now again, Banaya, serious warrior. He does a whole bunch of neat stuff. Here he kills a lion in the pit on a snowy day, which is a great picture, great word picture, right? The lion falls into a cistern, and all the guys say, who's going to get the lion out? He can't get out. And Benaya's like, I got him. And he jumps down the pit and kills him. Really serious things. He kills an Egyptian with his own spear. So these are pictures of things that he's done that are incredibly mighty. It's pretty neat little battles that he's done. And it says again, he's honored among the 30. So you have Abishai at the top of the 30, and then Banaya is like honored among the 30, and then the rest of the 30 are sort of a one lump. So you have Abishai, Banaya, and then everybody else. But you notice it says at the end of verse 23 that David appointed him over his guard. These are the Cherethites and the Pelethites. And these guys are serious warriors, and they're David's private guard, essentially. And so Banaya has this very high, exalted position as the commander over David's private guard. So you have Abishai, who's over the 30, and then Banaya, who's under Abishai, but then is also in charge of this group of guards. And so that's these two that are sort of the leaders of the 30. And then starting in verse 24, you have the list of the 30. Now, again, there's nothing here that's really, really important. There's lots of interesting little connections with towns and names and all those sorts of things. The majority of these people are from Judah, and so they're probably people that David knew for most of his life. You have several that die. We have Asahel at the beginning and Uriah the Hittite at the end, both of whom are dead. One is one of the brothers of Abishai, and the other, Uriah the Hittite, he's a foreigner. He's a Hittite who has come in, but who still obviously worship Yahweh, according to what we find out in 2 Samuel 11. Now, the point of all of this, the 37 that are here, the point of all of it is you have this group of elite fighting warriors that God puts together for the sake of protecting David. So you take all of those warriors, the 3, and then you have Abishai and Banaya, and then you have the 30. What's the point? The point is that God gave David some of the best warriors in the ancient Near East at this time. Why did he do that? Well, really for one purpose: to show loving kindness to his anointed and to protect the covenant. When God's on your side, he's going to put people in place that are going to help to make that happen. And there's a reason for that. He wants to protect the covenant of David because David will ultimately bring the Messiah into the world. And so David's covenant is protected because God is protecting David, and that's the purpose of this section. And really that's the narrator's purpose as well. That's why he includes the heroes here. Now remember, you remember again that we're talking about this chiasm that goes in, and the center of the chiasm is verse 51, that God shows loving kindness to David and to his seed forever. Then now we're moving out of the chiasm, and so we had the poems that are the next step out, and then here we have the heroes that are the next step out. The first set of heroes are the giant killers, and this set of heroes are those who are the mighty men. And so we have the heroes, and the last thing we're going to do is we're going to see the one that parallels with David's kindness or David's covenant loyalty to the Gibeonites. Now, I hope all that makes sense. I know it's a little long, but if you have any questions, feel free to either ask your care group leader, or you can always just leave a message in the comments below. Thanks so much.